So in the book, you write, how can I be black and a Christian? How can I be black and a Christian? And that, for a lot of us right now, and I'm going to speak for myself, you know, we were talking about the mythology of America earlier. Drew and I were talking about, all of the myths today is quote unquote Columbus Day, but it's really not, all of the things we were taught, not true. Indigenous Peoples Day. We never talked about that growing up, and all that we just talked about Blanche Bruce and all of the black people in Reconstruction that were in office that are never taught in school. This myth of whiteness, all of this is a myth. And then you think about the Bible, these collections of stories, these books kind of crafted together by some council, books left out, some put in, women put in a certain position, slaves, honor your masters, and all of this stuff used to weaponize this thing called slavery, right? And the patriarchy is tough, many of us to lean in. For me, the due north is always God. I can always find God in the midst of all of this. Right. I'm a strip apart all of the words that hold me back, but I'm a stick to the spirit. For you, how are you black and a Christian?
Yes, and that's a great question, and that's really at the heart of my book. It's me wrestling with the question that I felt like gave my book the substance. Like somebody was asking me the other day, like, what's the answer? What's the answer? And I'm reminded of like Octavia Butler, one of her students was like, yo, like you write about the parables and things like that. And you're like, the student asked, is it as bad as you write about in the parable? And, Octavia Butler was like, well, it may not be bad as I write about, but, I looked at the problems in the present, I allowed them 30 years, and to become full-fledged disasters. And he says, what is the answer? Octavia Butler says, there is no single answer, but you can become one of them if you choose to be. And as I think about my own story, and I think about, so much of at the heart of my book, that question, what does it mean to be Black and Christian and American, is that ability to try and wrestle with, the ways in which those identities and experiences intersect in the most beautiful and terrible ways possible. And so like, I got to give some type of answers in a sense. So like the way I thought about like being Black and Christian, like it meant that I needed to go home. Like as I write about in the book, I was raised Pentecostal, and I'm still very much Pentecostal to this day. I'm very much, you put on a praise break track, I'll shout with you. You give me a pulpit and a mic and the Bible, I'll preach you down. You give me a prayer room, we're gonna pray, we're going to the throne, and things like that. I'm very much Pentecostal. But throughout my life and the transitions that I made, whether that was to Clemson or whether that was to California, and even into the white church, there were so many bad things I learned about Blackness and Black people that I had to deconstruct and I had to dismantle. And I'm reminded of Audre Lorde. So much of that question, the way I wrote that question was very particularly crafted. I
saw it.
So Audre Lorde and Zombie writes, I remember what it's like to be young, to be Black and young and gay and lonely. And so I wanted to kind of riffing off the way Audre Lorde approached that question. She didn't use commas. And I think that was like intuitive. Like you have to use, she used and for her and for me, like I have to look at the ways in which those identities and those experiences intersect, but I need to be able to deal with them on their own so that hopefully the best of what they each have to offer, I can embody. So when I think about being Black, I had to go back home. I had to go back to my peoples. I write about my grandma, my granddaddy, my mama, my uncles, my daddy, them Black folk back home. So what I was doing was this. I was particularly doing Black studies. I was doing what Terry-Ann Williamson did and Scandalize My Name. I was taking the world, making the Black people seriously. So how do I be Christian, Black and Christian? I take Black people seriously, not as a footnote in white people's stories, but that our lives have something of the wisdom and the revelation of God in life that in some sense that we can learn from and that we can embrace and that we can explore and embody. But then being Christian, like you said, I had to deconstruct so many of the ways we learn how to be terrible Christians. So much of the ways in which insecurity and fear is at the heart of our faith rather than liberation and love. And then when I thought about being American, I had to think about the ways in which our country has treated us and the ways in which Christianity sits at the heart of much of that justification. And I had to figure out how to do a certain type of creative questioning while looking at myself and not making myself the hero. Because that question, being Black and Christian and American, I failed tremendously in this book at answering that, at living out that question. You know, the ways I craft my narrative, I failed tremendously. But in some sense, it was in that failure that I learned the lessons that became life-giving. And it was in facing those questions that I had, you know, in some sense, I became, you know, more responsible. I think better at answering that question, you know, there's more healing to hold than simply, you know, trying to create arguments and fight all the time.
Dante, what I'm curious about is I look at the stats and things like that around younger people, particularly younger Black folks, not necessarily embracing church in the same way that my generation and previous generations of Black folks embrace church as part of the solution to the problem, as opposed to church being part of the problem. And that is, I see it so much in like younger people all the time, right? How do you start to rationalize what the church has to do and what people of God have to do to add context to that, and to sort of help not just religion, but Christianity specifically be more inviting to younger Black folks, that younger Black folks see it as a solution versus a problem?
Yeah. Oh man, great question. I was even thinking about this today, literally. There's this thing, you know, that we Christians say oftentimes, you know, that the church is the hope of the world, that the church is the hope of the world. And I don't particularly believe that, in the sense that like the church is the hope of the world, because so much of the church, you know, is harmful, you know, and in some sense, we have to always, let me go here, because like my background's in sociology, and so much of what I learned in sociology really helps me navigate the systems and the institutions that we have inherited. And that's the thing, like each one of us, no matter where we are at in life, we inherit traditions, we inherit theologies, some of them which are more helpful and healing and whole than others, some of them which are more exploitive, terrible, trauma-inducing, and everything. And we have to critically engage, you know, the theologies and the traditions that we have inherited. We got to know what that's like. And I'm so reminded of Baldwin's writing in The Fire Next Time. So I'm doing my seminary. I'm in seminary right now. And I'm gonna say, like, so many of the questions about like the church and tradition, you know, I bring limitations to the table just because I'm young. I'm 29, I'm learning, I'm growing. So take whatever I say with a grain of salt and go to a book. Whatnot, you know, and just—
I love you for that. I love you for that. Go ahead.
Yeah. Take what I'm saying as a learner. I'm a student, and I'm just a part of a conversation. You know, I've inherited a tradition in the theology, but also inherited, you know, a long-standing conversation. And so just to preface whatever I say with that. But, you know, in some sense, we have to realize that so many of the theologies and the traditions that we have inherited are not neutral. You know, I was raised Pentecostal, particularly apostolic. That history is coming out of Kojic and then going into Cool JC. Many of their histories coming back to Azusa Street and the Azusa Street revival was rooted in William Seymour and the Los Angeles movements. But also many of these movements was incredibly patriarchal. They existed, you know, in some sense at the heart of protecting, you know, the patriarchy, of protecting a certain type of power among leaders, a certain type of power dynamic that did not allow certain people to ask questions. So the way that Audre Lorde ends that essay, the transformation of silence into language, they weren't doing that critical theological and religious work, transforming silence into language. What they were doing were exploiting silences and protecting and embodying trauma and protecting power. And so oftentimes, so many of, speaking of young people, as I think about so many of the young people today, it's not that many of us have given up, you know, on Jesus or religion or the church. It's that many young people, we're putting up with less. We're putting up with less type of ways of, thinking about faith that makes faith this kind of immovable, abstract force that cannot be touched or questioned, but that is all powerful in our lives. And in some sense, Jesus didn't even believe that about himself. The one who we believe is at the heart of our faith allowed himself to be in limited time and space, be touched and to touch and be touched by other people's realities, to learn from them. The Bible says he grew up in wisdom and stature. But so oftentimes we Christians, we are people who believe that there is no wisdom, no stature, no maturity that must be had. And oftentimes when that happened, young people, particularly us millennials and Gen Z, we don't put up, the world we grow up in is more complex than many of the worlds that y'all and your parents and our parents allowed themselves to embrace. And as I see in the way Audre Lorde is talking about silence and language, one has to realize that in our complexity, we find our liberation. And I think as young people are able to embrace the complexity of the questions of faith and the ways in which, our traditions can be problematic and powerful. Our Bible can be, weird and in some sense, terrible in many ways, but also sacred. When we can live in the tension, in those type of tensions, I think we'll be better able to ask questions and embrace these questions and embrace one another. And as I think about Jesus, he says like the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy, but I've come that you might have life. And I wonder often, and many people wonder why so many people leave the church, is because they find life in places that Jesus, they find life in places alternative to the places that Jesus told them that they would find life in. Oftentimes, the church is not a place where people come alive, whether you're young, back to Audre Lorde. I remember what it's like to be young and Black and gay and lonely. Why should the church be a place where someone can write about their memory of being young and Black and gay and lonely in such ways that's traumatic and not life-giving? And I think so many young people, when they're able to ask those questions and name those identities and name those realities, then I think we Christians would be much better at being a little bit more like Jesus and a little bit less like white evangelicals. So,
in a word, knock off the hypocrisy. 866-801-8255. That would help tremendously. Dante Stewart is here. Also, he goes by the name of Church Boy. Also goes by the name of Vacuum Boy. Also goes by the name of Deborah's Boy and Little Calvin. And Stu. He's got a lot of names. That's what you get a lot of nicknames when you grow up in the South. And Augusta, which is where my mom grew up, is one of your stomping grounds. His book, Shouting in the Fire, which I feel like is a riff of The Fire Next Time, James Baldwin, because you reference him a lot in this book as well. Did you pull, because you seem to be leaning into Baldwin a lot? Why?
Yeah, so it's a story, because like when I was going through leaving the white evangelical church, ironically,
pause for a second. How'd you end up in the white evangelical church to begin with? How does one even end up in a white evangelical? Well, how do you do that?
How do you even end up in a white evangelical church? So I ended up in the white evangelical church, through college. So many of us, who play sports in college end up, so many of us end up who play football in college end up around white Christians, as I did through FCA. So like FCA is Fellowship of Christian Athletes, and usually, those who have closest proximity to athletes are white Christian institutions and white Christian
and donors.
And donors, yeah, 100%. So those who have closest proximity to us are those, they're carefully, let's just say they're carefully curated. Or whatnot. It's a very careful curation. And so when I was at Clemson, that's when I got engaged in FCA, got hooked up in FCA, Fellowship of Christian Athletes, started worshiping around white people. And then I started taking on this narrative, that to be closer to whiteness is to be closer to God, and that, to listen more to what white people say about Jesus is, in some sense, to be more Christian and more solid and more and good in some sense, and moral. And so like so many of us who are playing football, we kind of received this script that like you know, as I write about, you know, I'm not Black, I'm Christian. And so I said that so many times. It's like I'm Black. I mean, I'm Christian. I'm not Black. I mean, I'm Christian. I'm not Black. Or I'm an athlete. I'm not Black. So like when Trayvon was murdered and my teammates stood in solidarity for a picture in hoodies. You know, I was not one of those people. I was that dude. You know, like I was that guy. Like I was that Black.
You were Herschel Walker.
Oh, I was Herschel Walker, like 100%, 100%. And I own that, you know, like, and I have to own that because so many of us are like that. You know, there's something particular about being in white social spaces. And I'm thinking religious, I'm thinking sports, I'm thinking business, I'm thinking political, you know, that rewards us, particularly Black men. It's particularly Black men. Let's be honest about that. It's mostly Black men who are rewarded for being in proximity to white people. We learn how to talk and we're charismatic, you know, and we learn how to read their books and we can, you know, we're athletic. We shoot the ball real good. We run fast, we jump high. And we do all these things that don't make white people deal with what it means to be white in this country and the ways in which, you know, in some sense, as I write about in this, I wrote this essay last year called Dear White Clemson Fan, or whatnot. And we Black dudes in that, and I was talking about this in that essay, like, yo, we Black athletes oftentimes, you know, we give white people what they don't deserve. So many memories around the dinner table to talk about how good we are on the field, but we allow them to evade how bad they are when we leave it. And so when we assimilate, you know, like I was a walk-on, then I got put on scholarship, then I played, you know, there was just too much at stake. So I put in that, that chapter wages, you know, that metaphor for me was necessary because at the heart of that, you know, assimilation is there's always a cost and there's always a price to pay. And so when you're trying to play and things like that, you know, you ain't on stable ground. And so there's so much that you quote unquote can't do because of the punishment and the ways in which like your rewards, you know, are always transactional. And if you don't uphold your end of the bargain, you can lose that and you become now, you know, those bad Black dudes, you know, those distractions that so many white coaches talk about. And so, yeah, that's how I ended up, you know, in those spaces was through football.